My name is Emily Carter, and I'm 29 years old. If someone had told me 5 years ago that my own parents would try to turn me into a tenant inside the house I legally owned, I would have laughed. Then I would have apologized for laughing. Because no parents could be that cruel. At least that's what I believed. Growing up, my parents always had one favorite child. It wasn't me, it was my younger brother, Jason. Jason could do no wrong. If he failed a class, the teacher was blamed. If he crashed a car, the other driver was blamed. If he quit another job after 2 weeks, his boss didn't appreciate his talent. Meanwhile, I worked since I was 16, straight A's, scholarships, 2 jobs through college. Every achievement was met with the same sentence. That's what you're supposed to do. I stopped expecting praise years ago. When I graduated from nursing school, I didn't ask my parents for money. I didn't ask them for help. I only wanted one thing, a chance to build my own life. 3 years later, I had saved almost every dollar I earned. While my friends were buying new cars and taking vacations, I lived in a tiny apartment with peeling paint because I had one goal: buy a house. The housing market wasn't kind. Every offer I made got rejected. Every month, prices climbed higher. Then one afternoon, my realtor called. "Emily, I found something. It wasn't perfect. The kitchen needed remodeling. The roof would need replacing in a few years, but the neighborhood was safe. The backyard was huge, and for the first time, I could actually afford it." 30 days later, I stood in the empty living room holding my keys. I cried, not because the house was beautiful, because it represented every overtime shift, every holiday I worked, every sacrifice I'd made. It was mine, or so I thought. About 2 months after moving in, my parents called. "We're thinking about downsizing," my mom said. "The stairs in our house are getting harder." Dad quickly added, "Your house has a first-floor bedroom." The conversation sounded innocent, until Mom said, "We'll move in with you for a while." I hesitated. A while? Oh, maybe 6 months. Family helps family. That's what I kept telling myself. They were my parents. So I agreed. The 6 months became permanent almost immediately. Within weeks, my mother had redecorated my kitchen without asking. My father replaced my furniture because he said mine looked cheap. Then came the biggest surprise. One evening, I came home after a 12-hour hospital shift. My bedroom door was locked. I knocked. Jason opened it. "What are you doing in my room?" He shrugged. "Mom said I could have it." I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Mom walked over carrying laundry. "It makes more sense. Jason needs more space." I stared at her. "So where exactly am I supposed to sleep?" She smiled. "The guest room. The smallest room in the house. My house." I wanted to argue. Instead, exhaustion won. I carried my blankets into the guest room. That should have been the moment I told everyone to leave. But I didn't. I kept hoping things would go back to normal. Instead, they got worse. A few weeks later, I noticed something strange. My mailbox was almost empty. Bills I normally received weren't arriving. One afternoon, I checked online and realized my electricity bill was overdue. Impossible. I always paid on time. I called the company. The representative said, "We've been mailing the statements." Confused, I searched the house. Nothing. That evening, I found my mom opening my mail. "My bills were in your room," I said. She didn't even look embarrassed. "We've been organizing everything." Organizing? She had opened every piece of my mail. Then Dad joined the conversation. "You really should let us manage your finances." I laughed. "No." His face hardened. "You still have a lot to learn." I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. A month later, I walked into the kitchen after work. My father placed a printed document on the table. "We've decided something." I looked down. It was a rental agreement. My name was listed as the tenant. Monthly rent, $2,400. I looked at Dad. "What is this? You live here?" I blinked. "I own here." Mom folded her arms. "Since we're paying household expenses, it's only fair you contribute." I actually thought they were joking. Then Dad pushed a pen across the table. "Sign it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I bought this house. I pay the mortgage. My name is the only one on the deed. Jason smirked from the couch. "Rules change." Dad leaned forward. "As long as we're living here, this house follows our rules." The room went completely silent. That was the exact moment I stopped seeing them as my parents and started seeing them as people who believed they could steal everything I'd worked for. They thought I was trapped. They thought I would stay quiet. They had absolutely no idea. I had already started planning The one move that would make them regret every single thing they'd done. For the first time in my life, I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't remind my parents that every payment on the mortgage came from my bank account. Instead, I picked up the fake rental agreement, smiled politely, and said the one word they never expected. Okay. The look on my father's face was priceless. He expected a fight. Instead, he got cooperation. He thought he'd won. He had no idea that the moment I stopped arguing was the moment I started planning. That night, after everyone went to bed, I locked myself in the guest room and pulled out every document related to the house. Closing papers, mortgage statements, insurance, property tax records, the deed. Everything listed only one owner, Emily Carter. No co-owner, no trust, no life estate, nothing. Legally, the house belonged to me. Still, I wanted to be absolutely certain. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with a real estate attorney. I didn't tell anyone. I even took a vacation day from work so my parents wouldn't suspect anything. The attorney listened quietly as I explained everything. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. So, they're trying to charge you rent? In your own house? I nodded. He actually laughed. I'm sorry, he said. I'm not laughing at you. I've just never heard something this ridiculous. Then his expression turned serious. Emily, let me ask you one question. Have they ever paid toward the mortgage? No. Utilities? Sometimes. Mostly small amounts. Property taxes? No. Any written agreement giving them ownership? No. He smiled. Then congratulations. What? You don't have a tenant problem. You have house guests. And house guests don't get to make rules. Hearing those words felt like someone had lifted 1,000 pounds off my shoulders. For months, I'd been questioning myself, wondering if I was somehow being selfish. I wasn't. I was being manipulated. The attorney gave me one piece of advice. Don't lose your temper. Let them keep believing they're in control. People like this usually destroy themselves. I followed his advice perfectly. At home, I acted exactly the same. I went to work, cooked dinner, smiled. Even when Jason parked his motorcycle across my driveway. Even when Mom invited her friends over without asking. Even when Dad criticized every decision I made. I stayed calm. That made them even bolder. A week later, my mother walked into the kitchen holding a notebook. We've made a budget. I looked up. For what? The household. She slid the paper toward me. It listed expenses. Electricity, water, internet, groceries. Then, rent, $2,400. She circled the number. We expect payment on the first of every month. I almost laughed. Instead, I simply asked, where should I send it? Dad answered proudly, our joint account. Perfect. Now I had proof. Every conversation after that happened through text messages. Whenever they demanded money, I replied politely. Whenever they threatened consequences, I stayed respectful. My attorney had suggested creating a paper trail. Without realizing it, they were building the case against themselves. One evening, I came home from work and my key didn't fit. I froze. Someone had changed the locks. I knocked. Jason opened the door with the biggest grin I'd ever seen. Oh, I forgot. Dad changed them. What? Dad appeared behind him. You'll use the back entrance from now on. I stared at him. This is my house. He shrugged. Not while we're living here. I didn't argue. Instead, I pulled out my phone. I recorded the entire conversation. Every word, every threat, every admission. Then I quietly spent the night at my best friend Megan's apartment. The next morning, my attorney listened to the recording. He smiled. They're making this incredibly easy. Can I throw them out today? You could, but... He pointed to the stack of evidence. We're going to do this the right way. Over the next month, I documented everything. Photos of the changed locks, videos of Jason refusing to let me into certain rooms, screenshots of text messages demanding rent, copies of every mortgage payment made from my account, bank records, property records, security camera footage I quietly installed outside. The cameras captured something unexpected. My parents were telling neighbors they owned the house. Dad even introduced himself as the homeowner. Every lie was recorded. Then came the moment everything changed. One Friday afternoon, I received a notification from my bank. Someone had tried to access my mortgage account. 3 failed login attempts. then another, then another. I immediately called the bank. The fraud department confirmed someone had tried changing the contact information. I knew exactly who it was. That evening, I walked into the living room. My parents were watching television like nothing had happened. I calmly asked, "Did either of you try accessing my mortgage account today?" 3 faces looked at me. Silence. Then Dad smiled. "You should really trust your family more." That wasn't a denial. It was a confession disguised as an insult. I nodded once. "Thanks? For what?" Mom asked. "For answering my question." I walked away before they noticed the tiny red recording light on my phone. That single sentence would become one of the most important pieces of evidence later. They thought they were untouchable. They thought blood was stronger than the law. They had no idea that, while they were pretending to own my house, the attorney was already preparing the paperwork that would legally remove every single one of them. And once the court approved it, the very people who tried to make me pay rent in my own home would soon discover what it feels like to stand on the front porch with nowhere left to go. The court hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't threaten them. I didn't even hint that something was about to happen. Instead, I let them continue believing they had already won. The night before the hearing, my dad walked into the kitchen while I was making coffee. "So," he said with a smug smile, "have you decided how you're going to pay your rent?" I looked at him calmly. "I've got everything handled." He laughed. "I knew you'd come around." For the first time in months, I almost smiled. Not because I agreed with him, because I knew that by this time tomorrow, his world would look very different. The hearing lasted less than 30 minutes. My attorney presented everything: the deed, the mortgage statements, the property tax records, the fake rental agreement they had created, the text messages demanding rent, the recordings of my father claiming the house was his, the videos showing they had changed the locks, restricted my access to rooms inside my own home. The judge reviewed every document carefully. Then he looked directly at my parents. "Do either of you have any legal ownership of this property?" My father cleared his throat. "We're her parents." The judge nodded. "That wasn't my question." Silence. My mother finally spoke. "We've lived there for months." Again, the judge replied. "That wasn't my question." Neither of them had an answer. Because there wasn't one. The judge signed the order. They were given a deadline to leave the property. If they refused, the sheriff's department would remove them. Just like that, months of manipulation ended with one signature. When I arrived home that afternoon, nothing had changed. At least not yet. Jason was playing video games in the living room. Mom was scrolling through her phone. Dad was sitting in my favorite chair reading the newspaper. He looked up. "You're late." I calmly placed a sealed envelope on the coffee table. "What's this?" he asked. "You should read it." He opened it carelessly. 30 seconds later, the color drained from his face. Mom noticed immediately. "What is it?" He didn't answer. She grabbed the papers from his hands. As she read the court order, her voice became shaky. "No, this can't be real." Jason stood up. "What happened?" Dad slammed the papers onto the table. "She's trying to throw us out." I corrected him. "I'm not trying. I already did." The room exploded. Mom started crying. Jason began yelling. Dad pointed his finger at me. "You called a lawyer?" "Yes." "You took us to court?" "Yes." "You'd do this to your own family?" I looked him straight in the eyes. "You mean the family that charged me rent in my own house?" Nobody answered, because nobody could. Over the next few days, they tried everything. First came the guilt. "We sacrificed everything for you." Then came the anger. "You're an ungrateful daughter." Then came the bargaining. "If you let us stay, we'll help with the bills." I almost laughed. Help with bills. The same people who tried to steal my home suddenly wanted to negotiate. I simply repeated the same sentence every time. The court has already made its decision. Nothing more, nothing less. 3 days before the eviction deadline, my father had one last idea. He invited several relatives over without telling me. By the time I got home from work, my living room was full. Aunts, uncles, cousins. Everyone stared at me. One of my uncles stood up. "Emily, this is embarrassing. You can't kick your parents onto the street." Before I could answer, my father spoke dramatically. "We gave her everything. We raised her, and now she's abandoning us." Several relatives nodded. Then I quietly walked to my desk. I picked up a folder. Inside were copies of every piece of evidence. I handed the first document to my uncle. Then another, the deed, the fake lease, the text messages, the recordings, the photographs, The court order. The room became completely silent. One by one, the relatives realized what had actually happened. My aunt looked at my mother in disbelief. You tried to charge her rent? In her own house? No answer. Another cousin looked at Jason. You took her bedroom. He looked down at the floor. My uncle slowly closed the folder. Then he turned to my parents. I thought she was the problem. I was wrong. One family after another quietly stood up. Without another word, they left. For the first time, my parents had no one left to defend them. The eviction deadline arrived. My parents still hadn't packed. Dad sat on the couch with his arms crossed. They won't remove us. They're bluffing. At exactly 9 a.m., there was a loud knock on the front door. I already knew who it was. Dad opened the door confidently. Standing outside were 2 sheriff's deputies. One deputy politely said, "Good morning. We're here to enforce the court's eviction order." My father's confidence disappeared instantly. He looked at me, then back at the deputies, then at the boxes that still hadn't been packed. For the first time, he realized this wasn't a family argument anymore. It was the law, and the law had chosen a side. At exactly 9 a.m., the sheriff's deputies stepped onto my front porch. My father stood in the doorway, trying to block the entrance. "This is a family matter," he said firmly. One of the deputies remained calm. "Sir, this is now a court matter." He handed my father a copy of the eviction order. "You've been given every opportunity to leave voluntarily. Today, we're here to enforce the judge's order." For a moment, no one moved. Then my father looked at me. His confident smile, the one he'd worn for months, was gone. "You'd really do this?" I met his eyes. "No, you did this." Silence. My mother suddenly burst into tears. "Emily, please, we're your parents. Where are we supposed to go?" I wanted to believe those tears were genuine, but I remembered every moment that had brought us here. The day they took my bedroom, the day they changed my locks, the fake rental agreement, the constant insults, the attempts to access my mortgage account, the lies they told our relatives and neighbors. They never apologized. They were only sorry because they had lost. I took a deep breath. I gave you months to treat me with respect. You chose control instead. The deputies gave them one final opportunity to collect their belongings. Jason was furious. "This is all your fault." "No," I replied quietly. "It's the consequence of your choices." He didn't have an answer. For the next 2 hours, movers carried boxes out of the house. Furniture, clothes, electronics, everything they owned disappeared into a moving truck. Neighbors watched from their driveways. Months earlier, my parents had proudly told everyone they owned my house. Now those same neighbors watched the truth unfold. No one laughed. No one celebrated. They simply watched as reality replaced the story my parents had invented. Before leaving, my father walked back to the front door one last time. "I hope you're happy." I looked around the house. The walls were scratched. The floors were damaged. The kitchen cabinets my mother had replaced without permission were crooked. The house needed repairs. But for the first time in nearly a year, it felt peaceful. "I will be," I answered, "as soon as I make this house my home again." He shook his head and walked away. That was the last time I saw him. The following weeks were busy. I changed every lock, installed a new security system, repainted every room, turned my old bedroom back into the peaceful space I'd always wanted. The guest room, where I'd spent months feeling like a stranger in my own home, became a home office. Little by little, the house felt like mine again. Not because the paperwork said so, because the fear was finally gone. About 3 months later, I received one final surprise. My attorney called. "You might find this interesting." "What happened?" He laughed softly. "Your parents tried to challenge the eviction." My stomach tightened. "And?" The judge dismissed it almost immediately. There was no legal basis. Then he added something I never expected. "They were also ordered to reimburse part of your legal costs." I couldn't believe it. The people who had demanded $2,400 a month in fake rent were now legally required to help pay the expenses caused by their own actions. My attorney chuckled. "I guess you could say they paid the last bill with their eviction." For the first time in months, I laughed, a real laugh. Word eventually spread through the family. The relatives who had believed my parents' version of the story called to apologize. Some admitted they judged me too quickly. Others said they admired that I'd stood up for myself without yelling, threatening, or seeking revenge through cruelty. I accepted the apologies, but I never forgot the lesson. Being family doesn't give someone permission to control you. Love without respect isn't love, and setting boundaries isn't betrayal. Sometimes it's the only way to protect your peace. A year later, I stood in my backyard on a warm summer evening, looking at the house I'd worked so hard to buy. Friends filled the patio with laughter. The grill was smoking. Music played softly in the background. For the first time since moving in, it finally felt like home. Not because the house had changed, because I had. I no longer felt guilty for choosing myself. I no longer apologized for protecting what I'd earned. And I no longer confused forgiveness with allowing people to hurt me again. Sometimes people think revenge means making someone suffer. They're wrong. The greatest revenge is building a peaceful life that no one can take away. As I locked my front door that night, I smiled. This house had always belonged to me. Now, so did my future.